Kuao ordered Victoria to go by a new name, Anna, and she had obtained a passport and documents for a child under this name. From then onwards, as the pair journeyed to Europe, Kuao would pass Victoria off as her daughter. When Victoria and Kuao began their lives together in Paris, Victoria's school noticed Victoria's frequent absences. Ultimately, Victoria's attendance was only at 50%. She had also become more sullen and withdrawn and was seen with abrasions to her head. But Kuao would claim that Victoria simply had a medical condition that caused this, and even forged doctor's notes for Victoria. The truth was that Kuao was beating Victoria for the smallest slight and would keep her away from school to allow for her injuries to heal. In March, teachers noticed that Victoria's hair had been shaved off, and there was evidence of cuts, blisters, and bruises. Soon, the school, working in tandem with social services, began to formulate a plan. After social services became involved, Kuao took Victoria to London in April 1999, where the abuse escalated to unimaginable levels. The turning point came when Kuao met 27-year-old Carl Manning, a bus driver, and the couple moved into his one-bedroom flat in Tottenham. Previously, Victoria and her great-aunt had been living in a noisy hostel. At that point, Victoria's English skills were limited, and she relied on Kuao for all communication to those around her, which further isolated her. Social services had already been contacted by a distant relative of Kuao's, named Esther Aka, who was also in the United Kingdom. She had noticed the blisters on Victoria's scalp, her malnourishment, and the way she cowered in front of Kuao. But even after relaying her concerns, nothing was done to help Victoria aside from a report being filed. It was at Carl Manning's apartment that Victoria's life became a living nightmare. Manning believed Victoria was Kuao's biological daughter, and for whatever reason, he hated her. He began subjecting the helpless child to unspeakable acts of cruelty, while Kuao turned a blind eye to her niece's suffering. Kuao eventually tried to force Victoria onto a childminder named Priscilla Cameron, telling her that Manning hated her and she needed to leave Victoria there indefinitely. When Victoria entered the home, Priscilla took off her cap and long-sleeved shirt. When Victoria's cap was removed, Priscilla could see cuts on the child's face and one injury so deep that the skin below her right eye was hanging by a thread. Her cheeks had also been burned. The next day, Priscilla heard Victoria groaning from the bedroom. She was writhing in pain, and when Priscilla removed her clothes, it was revealed that her extremities were covered with cigarette burns, and the wounds had become infected. She was immediately taken to the Central Middlesex Hospital by Priscilla. There, Victoria was examined by Dr. Ekundayo Ajayi Obe. Victoria's injuries were so extensive that the examination took roughly 2 hours. Once again, Brent Social Services were contacted. Victoria was placed in protective services, but when staff rotation occurred at the hospital, Dr. Ruby Schwartz determined that Victoria had scabies and not cigarette burns consistent with abuse. She overruled the previous diagnosis, and the protection service was revoked, and Kuao was called to fetch her. At Manning's apartment, Victoria was forced to sleep in a bin liner filled with her own excrement, bound and left in an unheated bathroom. They refused to let her watch television or even speak to anyone outside of their home. The couple burned her with cigarettes, scalded her with hot water, and beat her with bike chains, hammers, wires, and their bare hands. They starved her, tied her up for hours on end, and made her eat like a dog, throwing food at her and forcing her to catch it in her mouth. Manning would also routinely punch the little girl, especially if she had a bathroom accident. In July 1999, Victoria was admitted to hospital a second time, this time by Kuao, for severe scalding and other injuries. Although there were signs of neglect and abuse, the consultant wrote that Victoria was fit to be discharged after a 13-day stay, and she was released back into Kuao's care. Haringey Social Services was notified of the injuries Victoria had sustained and was due to make a house visit in August, but canceled after learning of the false scabies diagnosis. Social Services tried to make more home visits, but Marie Kuao would not take calls, and all knocks on the door went unanswered. On February 24, 2000, Kuao took Victoria to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God and pleaded with the elders to bless her as she was possessed by a demon. The elders were shocked. The extent of Victoria's injuries was truly horrifying. When she was finally taken to the hospital, she was unconscious, hypothermic, and suffering from multiple organ failure and malnutrition. The ambulance crew who transported her described Kuao's concern as not quite enough, and Manning's demeanor as almost as if he was not there. Victoria succumbed to her injuries the following day, on February 25, 2000, at the tender age of 8. The pathologist who examined her body noted 128 separate injuries and scars, describing it as the worst case of child abuse they had ever seen. The trial that followed revealed the depths of Kuao and Manning's depravity. Manning's diary entries referred to Victoria as Satan, claiming that no matter how hard he hit her, she did not cry or show signs of pain. Both were found guilty of murder and child cruelty and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge condemning their actions as subjecting Victoria to truly unimaginable suffering. The public outrage that followed led to the establishment of the Victoria Climby Inquiry, headed by Lord Laming. The inquiry uncovered numerous failings by the agencies involved in Victoria's care, painting a picture of understaffing, underfunding, and poor management. Shockingly, Haringey Council, responsible for Victoria's case, had diverted millions of pounds from its social services budget to other areas, leading to a deterioration in child protection services. The inquiry heard how, at the time of Victoria's death, Haringey had failed to assign social workers to over 100 children. The social workers directly involved in Victoria's case, Lisa Arthur Worry and Angela Mayers, were found to have made grave errors in judgment. Arthur Worry, who had only 19 months of child protection experience, was overworked and inadequately supervised. Her supervisor, Carol Baptiste, was accused of prioritizing discussions of her personal life over child protection cases. The inquiry also highlighted the racial dynamics at play, with the fear of being accused of racism potentially contributing to the inaction of the predominantly black staff involved in Victoria's case. The Laming Report, published in 2003, made 108 recommendations for reforming child protection in England. It called for the establishment of national and local committees and a national database of children at risk, and emphasized the need for better communication and coordination between agencies. Victoria's death and the subsequent inquiry had far-reaching consequences. It led to the formation of the Every Child Matters initiative, the introduction of the Children Act 2004, and the creation of the Office of the Children's Commissioner. However, the tragic reality remains that, despite these reforms, child abuse and neglect continue to claim lives. On average, 78 children are killed by parents or carers every year in the UK, a figure that has remained unchanged since the 1970s. As we reflect on Victoria's short life and the suffering she endured, we must ask ourselves, how many more children must die before we truly learn the lessons of the past? How many more inquiries, reforms, and promises will it take before we create a society where every child is safe, loved, and protected?